What if the most dangerous threat to the stability of the Western world wasn't a foreign invader, but the unchecked ego of its most celebrated military genius? It is October 1950, and the world stands on a razor's edge as General Douglas MacArthur, the American Caesar, prepares to cross a line from which there is no return. This is the story of a man who believed his intuition was superior to the collective wisdom of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the direct commands of the President of the United States. Before we dive into the heart of this high-stakes defiance, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or find most interesting. The Korean War had begun as a desperate struggle for survival, but by the autumn of 1950, MacArthur had orchestrated the brilliant Incheon landing, turning the tide of the conflict in a matter of days. This success solidified his belief in his own infallibility, a conviction that would soon clash violently with the cautious strategy of President Harry Truman in Washington. Truman, haunted by the specter of a Third World War involving the Soviet Union and a newly communist China, issued strict orders that American and UN forces must not provoke the Chinese across the Yalu River. However, MacArthur viewed the war through a different lens, seeing it not as a localized conflict to be contained, but as a crusade against the global spread of communism that required total victory at any cost. As UN forces pushed toward the 38th parallel, the tension between the general in Tokyo and the president in the White House reached a fever pitch, characterized by a series of coded cables and public pronouncements. MacArthur openly dismissed the intelligence reports suggesting that Chinese troops were massing on the border, famously telling Truman during their meeting at Wake Island on October 15, 1950, that the chance of Chinese intervention was minimal. When the Chinese People's Volunteer Army did cross the Yalu in late October, catching the 8th Army and the X-Corps off guard, MacArthur did not retreat or reconsider his stance. Instead, he doubled down on his aggressive strategy. He demanded the authority to bomb the bridges over the Yalu, and even suggested the use of tactical nuclear weapons to create a radioactive belt that would prevent future invasions. The defiance became public and personal when MacArthur began sending letters to politicians and news organizations, criticizing the Truman administration's policy of limited war as a recipe for disaster. He argued that there was no substitute for victory, and that the lives of his soldiers were being sacrificed on the altar of political expediency and European-centered diplomacy. Truman, who valued the principle of civilian control over the military above all else, viewed these outbursts as a direct challenge to the United States Constitution and his authority as Commander-in-Chief. The world watched in stunned silence as the most decorated general in American history openly mocked the orders of a superior, creating a constitutional crisis that threatened to derail the entire Cold War strategy of the West. By April 1951, the situation had become untenable for the Truman administration, as MacArthur's unauthorized communication with House Republican leader Joseph Martin became public, revealing the depth of his disagreement with the White House. Truman spent several sleepless nights consulting with General Omar Bradley and Secretary of State Dean Acheson, weighing the political fallout of firing a national hero against the risks of keeping a rogue general in command. On April 11, 1951, the order was finally issued, stripping MacArthur of all his commands and replacing him with General Matthew Ridgway. This decision sparked a firestorm of public outrage in the United States, with many viewing MacArthur as a martyr and Truman as a weak leader who betrayed a great patriot. Halfway through our exploration of this monumental clash of wills, it is clear that the repercussions of MacArthur's defiance still echo through the halls of history today. If you are finding this deep dive into the Korean War and the limits of military power compelling, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. MacArthur returned to the United States to a hero's welcome, delivering his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech before a joint session of Congress, while Truman's approval ratings plummeted to historic lows. Yet, as the dust settled, the hearings that followed revealed the dangerous reality of MacArthur's proposed escalations, which many military experts believed could have ignited a global nuclear holocaust. The narrative of MacArthur's defiance is not merely a tale of a disagreement between two men. It is a profound meditation on the nature of leadership, the necessity of accountability, and the thin line between confidence and hubris. In the years following his dismissal, The Korean War ground into a bloody stalemate, eventually ending in an armistice that remains in effect to this day, leaving the peninsula divided. MacArthur's legacy remains a subject of intense debate among historians, with some praising his strategic brilliance and others condemning his vanity and disregard for the democratic process. The confrontation forced the United States to define the role of its military in the nuclear age, establishing the precedent that the ultimate power must always reside with elected civilian officials, no matter the stature of the general in the field. As we reflect on these events from the perspective of the 21st century, we see the lasting impact of that 1951 showdown on international relations and military doctrine. The ghost of MacArthur still haunts the discussions of preemptive strikes and limited engagements, serving as a reminder of what happens when a commander loses sight of the broader political objectives of a nation. The story of what MacArthur said when he defied direct orders is a cautionary tale for any era, illustrating that the greatest victories are not always won on the battlefield, but in the restraint and wisdom of those who wield the most power. To ensure you don't miss our future journeys into the hidden corners of history, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. The magnitude of the crisis following MacArthur's dismissal cannot be overstated, as it represented the first major test of the American Republic's resilience in the shadow of the atomic bomb. While the public cheered for the returning hero in the streets of New York and Washington, the halls of the Pentagon were filled with a different kind of tension, a realization that the chain of command had nearly snapped under the weight of one man's ambition. General Omar Bradley, serving as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, eventually testified before Congress, famously stating that MacArthur's proposed strategy would have involved the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. This professional rebuke from his peers began to shift the narrative, peeling back the layers of MacArthur's charisma to reveal the strategic risks he had been willing to take with millions of lives. The general's insistence that he alone understood the Oriental mind and the true nature of the conflict in Asia had led him to disregard intelligence that showed massive Chinese troop movements, a failure that resulted in the harrowing retreat of Marines from the chosen reservoir. As the 1950s progressed, the geopolitical landscape of the Cold War was permanently shaped by the fallout of this internal American struggle. The principle of limited war, which MacArthur so vehemently loathed, became the standard operating procedure for the West, a recognition that in a nuclear-armed world, total victory was often a dangerous illusion. The clash between Truman and MacArthur also solidified the role of the National Security Council and strengthened the integration of diplomatic and military objectives, ensuring that no single theater commander could ever again dictate the foreign policy of the nation through sheer force of personality. In the quiet of his later years at the Waldorf Astoria, MacArthur remained a figure of immense influence. Yet he was a man out of time, a 19th century warrior king navigating a 20th century world of complex alliances and subtle shadow plays. His defiance had forced a young superpower to grow up, to understand that the burden of leadership involves the discipline to follow orders as much as the courage to give them, a lesson that resonated through the following decades of conflict in Vietnam and beyond. The deep-seated resentment MacArthur felt toward the Europe-first advocates in Washington colored his every decision, as he viewed the Pacific as the true center of the world's future. He believed that by refusing to expand the war into China, the United States was effectively surrendering the Asian continent to the Soviet sphere of influence, a fear that fueled his public insubordination. However, historians looking back at the logistics of 1951 argue that the American military was not prepared for a full-scale continental war against China, which would have drained resources away from the defense of Western Europe at a time when Stalin's Red Army stood poised at the Iron Curtain. Truman's decision, though politically suicidal at the moment, is now regarded by many as one of the most courageous acts of any American president, placing the long-term stability of the global order above his own popularity. The dramatic relief of MacArthur served as a definitive declaration that in a democracy, the sword is always subservient to the law, a concept that MacArthur, in his Caesar-like grandeur, had momentarily forgotten. By the time the armistice was signed in 1953, the world was a different place, more cautious and more aware of the devastating potential for escalation. The Korean Peninsula remained a scarred land, but the global conflagration MacArthur's actions might have sparked was avoided, leaving behind a legacy of the forgotten war that was actually a pivotal turning point in human history. The documents declassified in recent decades revealed just how close the world came to the brink, showing that MacArthur's defiance wasn't just about rhetoric. It was a series of tactical decisions that bypassed the Joint Chiefs and placed the world on a collision course with nuclear reality. To continue receiving these deep dives into the turning points of human history, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. The strategic tension during the winter of 1950 wasn't merely a clash of egos. It was a fundamental disagreement over the geography of power. MacArthur looked at the map of Northeast Asia and saw a chance to excise the cancer of global communism at its root by pursuing the retreating North Korean forces across the Yalu River and into the heart of Manchuria. He envisioned a total blockade of the Chinese coast and the deployment of nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan, a move that the State Department feared would trigger the Sino-Soviet Mutual Defense Treaty. In Washington, the maps looked different, showing a thin line of defense in Europe that would be easily overwhelmed if the United States committed its entire military strength to a grueling land war in the mountains of China. This disconnect led to a series of silent defiances, where MacArthur would receive directives to use only South Korean troops in the border provinces, only to ignore them and send American divisions to the very edge of the Chinese frontier. This tactical insubordination created a vacuum of reliable information, leaving the White House blind to the fact that nearly 300,000 Chinese soldiers had already slipped across the frozen river, waiting in the shadows of the high mountain passes for the trap to be sprung. As the disaster at the Chosin Reservoir unfolded, the narrative of MacArthur's leadership transformed from one of tactical genius to one of dangerous detachment. While his soldiers were freezing in sub-zero temperatures, fighting off wave after wave of human growth attacks, MacArthur remained in his headquarters in Tokyo, increasingly convinced that his failure was not due to his own intelligence lapses, but due to inhibitions placed upon him by the politicians in Washington. He began to issue communiques that were increasingly apocalyptic, suggesting that the very survival of the United States depended on the immediate escalation of the war, including the bombing of Chinese supply depots and the use of the ultimate weapon. It was during this period that the Joint Chiefs of Staff began to fear that MacArthur might take unilateral action, perhaps ordering a strike that could not be undone. The tension was palpable. Every telegram from Tokyo was scrutinized for signs of a complete break from reality or a formal declaration of independence from the chain of command. The president was forced into a corner where the preservation of the constitutional order became more important than the immediate outcome of the Korean conflict. The political theater that followed MacArthur's return to the United States was unlike anything seen in American history. When he landed in San Francisco, over 500,000 people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the man they believed had been silenced for being right. The American Caesar had returned not as a defeated general, but as a political titan, and for a few weeks in 1951, it seemed possible that he might ride this wave of populist fervor all the way to the presidency. However, the subsequent Senate hearings, known as the Russell Committee hearings, serve as a sobering counterbalance to the emotion of the ticker tape parades. Over several weeks of testimony, the military establishment, men like Marshall, Bradley, and Eisenhower, quietly and methodically dismantled MacArthur's arguments. They demonstrated that his plan for escalation was not a path to victory, but a path to a catastrophic global war that the United States was ill-equipped to win in 1951. As the technical details of logistics, Soviet nuclear capabilities, and European defense requirements came to light, the public's fervor began to cool, replaced by a realization of the terrifying risks MacArthur had been willing to take. This moment in history serves as the ultimate case study in the danger of a cult of personality within a military framework. MacArthur's career had been defined by his ability to transcend the limitations of ordinary men, from his daring escape from Corregidor to his masterful administration of post-war Japan. But in Korea, that same sense of destiny became a liability. He had reached a point where he believed his personal judgment was synonymous with a national interest, a psychological state that led him to view the President of the United States not as a commander, but as a bureaucratic obstacle to be overcome. The dismissal of Douglas MacArthur was a painful but necessary surgery on the American body politic, reaffirming that no individual, regardless of their past service or current brilliance, is above the collective civilian authority. It ensured that the United States would remain a republic governed by laws rather than a military state governed by the whims of its most powerful generals. The echoes of this confrontation remain a vital part of the training for every officer in the armed forces today, a reminder that the most difficult order to follow is often the one that tells you to stop. Looking back at the cold, hard facts of the 1950s, we see that the defiance of Douglas MacArthur was a catalyst for the modern concept of deterrence. It forced the world to accept that in the age of nuclear weapons, some conflicts must remain unresolved and some victories must remain unclaimed in order to ensure the survival of the human race. The general's words, "There is no substitute for victory," collided with the reality of a world that could no longer afford the luxury of total war. This transition was messy, dramatic, and filled with human conflict, but it ultimately defined the boundaries of the Cold War and prevented a hot war from consuming the globe. The legacy of that defiance is written in the peaceful borders of modern Europe and continued, albeit tense, stability of the Pacific Rim. To make sure you're part of our next deep dive into the moments that changed everything, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting.